Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Managing Unconscious Bias, Your Workplace Advantage webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded Thursday, May 29th, 2014. I would now like to turn the webinar over to Adam Langley. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the Managing Unconscious Bias, Your Workplace Advantage webinar. This webinar is brought to you by Workplace Answers, and your presenter is Dr. Sandra Thiederman. Whether you're a regular here or it's your first time joining us, we are very happy to have you with us. Before we get going, I'd like to tell you a little bit about us. Workplace Answers provides industry-specific compliance solutions for enterprise, higher education, and government organizations. Human resources leaders and risk mitigation teams trust our award-winning training content, services, and software to develop more engaged workforces and minimize exposure from complex legal requirements. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All audio should be coming through your computer speakers, so please ensure that your volume is turned up. You may submit questions to the speaker at any time today by typing through the chat feature located to the left of your screen. Questions will be addressed at the end as time allows and occasionally throughout the program. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded. Unfortunately, we won't be able to provide the actual PowerPoint slides for the presentation, but all registrants and attendees will receive an email next week with information on how to view the archived recording of the webinar and a download key to the key takeaways. You may receive a call from one of our reps after the webinar to ensure that you receive the link to the recording and to get your thoughts on the webinar and to see if there's any ways we might be able to help you with any of the issues discussed in today's webinar. Today's presenter, Dr. Sandra Thiederman, has 25 years experience as a speaker, trainer, and author on the topics of bias reduction, workplace inclusion, and cross-cultural business. Since receiving her doctorate from UCLA in cross-cultural studies, she has helped professionals in Fortune 500 companies, public sector organizations, and dozens of associations find ways to work more comfortably and effectively in an increasingly diverse environment. Sandra has served on the diversity cabinet of the American Red Cross and been widely featured in the media, including mention in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the New York Times. She's author of 5 books, including Making Diversity Work, 7 Steps for Defeating Bias in the Workplace, and Diversity and Inclusion Handbook, published by Walk the Talk Publishers. In her spare time, Sandra applies her interest in diversity in a very practical way. She volunteers as a puppy raiser for an organization called Canine Companions for Independence. She's currently raising her 9th dog for Canine Companions, and her hope is that it will one day become a life-changing assistance dog to a person with a disability. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sandra Thiederman.
Thanks so much, Adam. It's so great to be here, and what a treat to be a temporary member of the Workplace Answers team. It's really a privilege. And as you were doing that introduction, you mentioned that phrase, engaged workforce, that is one of your goals as an organization. And I was thinking about it as you were talking, that isn't that really what bias, one of many reasons that we need to get rid of our biases, because if we don't do that, we are going to have workforces that are alienated, divided, tense, and certainly not engaged. So I hope I can help in some small way toward that goal. Webinars are always strange things. You're sitting there, I was talking to the organizers before, and they said that most of you are sitting in a cubicle someplace, right? Or maybe if we're lucky in a coffee shop. And divided, and I am a disembodied voice. So I thought it might help a little bit to start out to give you an idea of where I am and what's going on with me, so you can picture that a little bit better. Notice I do not put up a picture of myself because I didn't put makeup on this morning, so we don't want that. However, I'm sitting in my home office in San Diego, California, and I am looking out on this scene. Now, it all looks a bit grander than it really is. That is not a real dog out there in the yard, but that's what I'm looking at with the dappled light of San Diego coming through. And it's also odd when you speak in this situation that you're talking to no one. I am talking to the air. I'm talking to that stone dog out there. So what I do is always try to make sure that there's someone to talk to. So at this moment, I am speaking to the dog that we are currently raising for Canine Companions for Independence, and so that you can know what I'm looking at, this is her. And so she's wiggling around a little bit. I've got a pen here that I can put her in if she gets a little too rambunctious. But know that if you hear the clang of something, that's what's going on. So I'll be talking to her. By the time I'm done raising this dog, she is going to know more about bias and diversity and inclusion than any other pup on the planet. So I hope that helps her as well. So we don't have a lot of time. But I really believe that in the next, where are we now, 45 minutes, because I'm going to try to stop about 10 minutes before the hour for questions, we can get some good basics down as to what we can do about biases within ourselves and within our workplaces. So this is what we're going to try to accomplish. This is the plan. To provide the skills and knowledge with which to minimize the impact of subtle and unconscious bias on the workplace. So we can't do that. We can't be effective at doing that unless we're in agreement about what a bias is. Now, if we were together, I would kick this around with you, and I would have you tell me your ideas about how you define bias and about what it entails and the like. But we don't have that luxury. So let me just put up the definition of bias that I work off of. It is that a bias is an inflexible, positive or negative, conscious or unconscious belief about a particular category of people. Now, a couple of interesting things to me about this definition. First of all, notice that a bias is a belief. It's an attitude. It's something that goes on inside your head. It's not a behavior. Now, of course, inappropriate, disrespectful behaviors happen that reflect biases and grow out of biased attitudes. But just to keep it real clear here about what we're talking about, I am talking about that attitude. And that attitude can be conscious or unconscious. We know that. We're going to try to emphasize the unconscious here today. And it's about a particular category of people. This is not a preference. Let me see. I like the color blue over the color green. That's a preference. Do I have a bias for the color blue over the color green? Yeah, but that's a different use of the word. Here we're talking inflexible about a group of people. So that means that the thing inside your head, whether you're aware of it or not, is that all members of a given group have a particular characteristic. All Southern Californians are flaky. Good one for me to choose since I'm from Southern California. All New Yorkers are loud. And we could go on and on and on with all kinds of different examples. All old people are not good at technology. Things like that. All young people are good at technology. Now, notice something else about this. That belief, the content of that belief, can be about a positive or negative characteristic. And I want to emphasize that because we're good people. I'll bet you everybody on this phone call is a good person. And probably we're doing pretty well with our biases. Not perfect. Nobody's perfect. Doesn't make you a bad person if you've got a bias. But we're probably pretty good people. So the biases we are apt to fall into are those positive ones, which doesn't mean that the act of having the bias is positive, but it does mean that the content of the inflexible belief is a positive characteristic. Again, normally I'd ask you for examples, but just to whiz through a few. All Asians are good at math, right? Common bias, and it is destructive. All Asians are hard workers. All women are nurturing. All African Americans are good at sports. All French people are good cooks. All gay men are artistic. It goes on and on and on. And it's all very nice, and we feel sort of good about it, but the problem is that that belief, even though the characteristic itself is a good thing, keeps us from seeing the person as an individual, and that's what messes us up. That's what keeps us from promoting them. That's what keeps us from giving them a job they're truly qualified for as one that we think they might be qualified for. And it's the one that causes us to be disrespectful to folks. We'll look at more examples as we go along, but keep that in mind. Along with that, again, having a bias doesn't make you a bad person. We all do. And also, members of any group can have biases. This is not a majority population thing. It's not a guy thing over a girl thing. It's any group can have them, and we all have a responsibility to work on them. Now, clearly, the biases that are held by those who have the power in the culture or in an organization have the greater danger of causing damage because they're coming from people with power. But nonetheless, at the same moment, we all need to work on these beliefs that we have. So, before we start digging into solutions and the like, let me give you a real brief look at how biases work. Here's what's going on with them. They keep us from seeing people accurately because they distort our view, right? And again, you have an inflexible belief about what someone is like, so every individual you meet, you figure they're that way. But this is why it happens. First of all, it is a psychological principle that we want to be right. We want the belief that we've carried all along to be correct because we don't want to give it up. It's just the way human beings are. So we give extra weight to the evidence that our bias is accurate. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say for the moment that a person has a bias that says people with disabilities will cause us more problems in the workplace. They're not an advantage because those people being there will create more work for those of us that are fully abled. Let's say you've got that bias. So one day you're sitting in your office and you're on the telephone and in the middle of something rather important. A person, a colleague of yours who has just come on board, comes into your office, and this human being uses a wheelchair. And he comes in, and it's urgent that he receive a folder that you've got, but you're on the phone. And he writes you a note real quick saying, where's this file? And you gesture to him that the file is on a bookcase that's in back of your desk, okay? Now, he can't reach that bookcase. So you have to reach over, all being careful not to, make sure you muted your phone and all the rest of it, grab the file and hand it to him. Inside your head, at that moment, because of your bias, comes this thought, see, I knew I was right. If he hadn't been in a wheelchair, he could have gotten that file for himself. When in fact, the truth was, no one could have reached that file from where it was stashed, in back of your desk on a bookcase. That's a good example of how we grab at it. Be careful. This is real dangerous. We have to stay very alert to what are we letting get in. Also, the brain more readily, just physiologically, neurologically, the brain more readily takes in and processes data that it and our bias expects to be there. And finally, we resort to biases when we are under stress. There were studies done by research psychologist Keith Payne, and he looked at this issue in a variety of different ways. And what he established was that the busier we are, the more stressed we are, the more immediate decisions we need to make, the more apt we are to make those decisions on the basis of previously held inflexible beliefs. It's logical that we would, but it doesn't work well. So in our workplaces today that are so stressed, where there is so much challenge, there isn't enough time, we're in real danger on this. And this is why I think this topic is so important for Workplace Answers to be dealing with. So let's talk about awareness. Knowing our biases gives us the power to both weaken them and control the behaviors they create. There's a couple of different ways that we can become aware of our biases. And the first one is really fascinating. I imagine, I'm sort of going to guess that maybe 20-25% of you are familiar with this. This is what's called the implicit association test. It originally was developed at Harvard University by Dr. Mahzarin Banaji. And it's online, as you can see here. And I've spoken to her about this, and what she has said to me, make sure when people take this test that they understand that This is designed to function as a red flag to them that there might be a bias there, as a little bit of evidence that there might be a bias there. It's not designed to definitely decide, that's it, you've got that bias. But it still has a lot of value. Now let me explain to you just very briefly what happens when you do this. First of all, you go online, you take it for free. It's not hooked to anybody else. Nobody in your workplace knows. I think they anonymously capture the information for their own research, but besides that, you can go in comfortably. I've done it, I think, 3 times now, and I've learned a great deal about myself. Pretty darn interesting. To put it most simply, when you go in, you choose a category of group that you want to begin to understand your own beliefs about better. And, you know, it varies. They change all the time. I mean, there might be one on weight, there might be one on age, there might be one on gender. There's, I think, always one on race. There's ethnicity and even political things during elections, I've noticed. All kinds of different ones. So you pick one you want to do. And what happens is you're presented with images on 2 different sides of the screen, left and right, and images of faces that clearly communicate to you the group to which the person belongs, like, say, a person who weighs more than our culture thinks they ought to weigh, and someone who is more what our culture keeps saying is thin or ideal or something like that. Then characteristics and sentences come up in the middle of the page and of the screen, and you are asked to pair those with one group or the other. Okay? Now, let's talk about, let's say it was a gender one. All right, so you've got men on one side, women on the other. Statement comes up, and it says, corporate CEO. Now, you're not stupid. You know that what ideally you want to think, and you impulsively, subconsciously want to say, is that it's a big neutral, right? Who cares, man, woman, doesn't matter. But you want to compensate too, because you're thinking, well, you know, you can't do neutral, so I know it wants me to say women. So you go in and you click that you're thinking the CEO connected with the female. But here's the deal. It's done by time. Fascinating. Just tiny bits of time. And the speed with which you do the matching is how it establishes whether or not you may kind of have a bias toward men and women in the corporate world. Okay? Again, remember, a red flag. I've taken it, learned a lot about myself. I would suggest that you go in and just mess around with it. One thing I learned, which I thought was very interesting, is that I have a bias for people with disabilities. And I thought about it, and I said, well, what's that about? You know, where was that coming from? And then I began to realize that what really was happening was that I was associating persons with disabilities with my work with Canine Companions for Independence, so that made it positive, okay? But it shows how subtle this stuff is. So go in, take a look. You'll find it really, really interesting. And if we have a minute at the end of the program, I've got a way that was identified by the University of Colorado that I won't tell you now to tease you, to temporarily cheat on the test. So it's kind of interesting. Tells you more about how the mind works. But go in and take a look at it. Now, I have another way to help us identify our unconscious biases. And this one is more portable. It doesn't require a computer. And what it requires is forming the habit of noticing the first thought that comes into your brain when you encounter someone from a group that's different from your own. Let me tell you how I came up with this and how it works. Years ago, I was doing a presentation on diversity inclusion to some meeting up in the wine country of California. Poor me, right? Hard luck, right? And I'd done the presentation, and I was walking back to my room from the meeting room, and the route I needed to take took me on a balcony that overlooked a seating area that was basically a bar, a lounge. And as I walked, I noticed that the door to the outside opened, and I could see the light shining in, and I could see that there was a bus outside, and that a bunch of folks that had just toured the wine country were coming in to the lounge and sitting down at these tables. And I noticed that these people were what we'd have to call elderly. They were 80, 85 years old, something sort of in there. And as I walked and saw them, this thought popped into my brain. Gee, I'm sure glad I'm not down there with them. Those conversations must be boring. I was shocked. I had no idea that I would think that. I had no reason to think that I knew of. I just came to it. I can picture it. I came to a hall. I put down my laptop case, and I stood there, and I said, Thederman, what is that about? This is how you make your living. And you're thinking those thoughts. And I've explored that further and all of that, but that made me realize we have the power, if we make it a habit, to watch those first thoughts as they pop into our brain and be aware of them so that we can then begin to heal them or at the very least compensate for them. So what I'm asking of you, I'm asking you to get in the habit of doing that. Pay attention to what comes into your mind. And what I would like to do rather quickly here is to give you some practice in that process. So I am going to pull up slides. I'm going back now. Going back, you didn't see that. I am going to pull up slides that are going to list 5 groups of people. I'm going to do them one by one. I'll allow a couple of seconds in between each one. And during that couple of seconds, I'd like you to just see what comes into your brain. That's all. Maybe nothing will. That's great. Maybe you'll think of a particular individual. That's fine too. But maybe some generality will come in, positive or negative. That's what I'm after, that generality. So let's do this. Let's go ahead. You've seen the first group already. In between each, what first thought comes? A homeless person, a person who smokes cigarettes, a single mother with 3 children, a native New Yorker, and a single father with 3 children. Now, every single time that I have done this activity, except for once, which was interesting, there's a very interesting reaction from the group around a single mother and a single father. Generally, this is what I get. People saying, a lot of women saying it, by the way, that the single mother is tired and overloaded, and that the single father is somehow heroic and especially good guy. Interesting, isn't it? Now, what does that have to do with your workplace? That has a heck of a lot to do with your workplace. What if you had a supervisor or a manager or yourself who was not aware that you had a bias that said, oh, the poor single woman, she must be so overloaded, right? Or that said, oh, he's a single dad, what a good guy he is, without knowing the individual in depth, right? I'm talking about looking at them from the outside. So you have an opportunity to promote someone or to give someone a special project. And you're looking at this woman and you're looking at the father and a couple of other people, and you're not aware of it, right? So you don't know you've got the belief. You just knee-jerk don't consider the mother because you don't want to add to her load. And you do consider the father because you want to reward him for being such a good guy and so brave and so heroic. It can happen to the best of us. So think about that and try to get in that habit. And take this, you have my permission, take this activity back into your workplace. Pretty darn interesting. Now, having done that though, like the implicit association test, just because you had the first thought does not automatically make it a bias. So let's take a look at how we can assess whether it's a bias. We need to analyze it, all right, to see if it really is. And you can do this to the ones you just did or as you live your life and the things that pop into your brain. Ask yourself, did I think a word like all or every or they? In other words, when the thought came in, did it have this inflexible generality quality to it? Yeah, if so, you're probably on biased territory. Also, ask yourself, would I feel the same way about the significance of this person's behavior if he or she were of a different group? Let me give you an example. Picture this. You're sitting in a meeting room, and a head executive in your company is giving a presentation, and it's a woman. And times are rough, competition's bad, things aren't looking so good, you're sliding behind in the technology, and she is trying to motivate people to get it together and beat the competition and all that. So she starts up on the stage, and she starts speaking. And she goes through her notes, and she's talking along, and gradually she becomes more animated. She begins to move her arms around. She begins to pace up and down on the stage. At one point, she even comes up and slams her hands down the podium, and then she walks out in the middle of the audience and walks back up. And at that point, you turn to the person next to you and whisper, "Gee, she sure is getting hysterical." Now, at that point, ask yourself this question. If she were a man, would you still have said that? Or would you have said, "Whoa, he's committed. Wow, he really puts himself into this. He really cares." Think about it. So ask yourself when these things pop into your brain, these first thoughts, what if you change the person? If you change the person and then you didn't have the bias anymore, probably a bias. Ask yourself, what do I do when I learn that an individual does not conform to my first thought? Do I just accept it? Well, if you just accept it, you're fine. Whatever. Oh, I was wrong. We're good. Do you feel kind of disoriented? Like, wait a minute, you're not who I need you to be? Then you might have a problem. Do you do something to create what you expected? I remember I used to work in hospitals a lot. I used to do a lot of training there. And the healthcare providers would sometimes have these biases about particular immigrant groups that they felt were going to be particularly demanding. And what we discovered was that when they had that bias, the healthcare staff would actually behave less friendly, less deferential, less courteous to members of that group because they expected them to be demanding, and therefore, they became demanding. So do we do something to create what we expected, or do we decide that person is an exception to the rule? So this is a basic way to become aware of your biases. But be careful, again, don't shoot yourself over it. It's just, okay, I had that thought, let's examine it in these ways. If it doesn't look so good here, let's start thinking about doing something about it. So I'm going to give you two techniques. First of all, we can do stuff. For a long time we used to act as if, well, we can't do anything about them, all we can do is work around them. Sure, the very most deeply rooted ones, yeah, maybe we're stuck, but a whole bunch we can do something about. So, two strategies. Strategy one, straightforward, is to weaken the foundation, kind of crack that foundation of it by using your brain and asking yourself a couple of real straightforward questions. First of all, was the source of the bias reliable? Now, this is how we learn biases, right? We learn them from people in our lives. We learn them from media. And we learn them from experience. That's real, okay? But how reliable were they, really? And the people in our lives, our parents, our teachers, people in the community, they're powerful. And I remember in my case, I grew up with good parents, but I sometimes think that I would be more free of bias if my parents' idea of a good time on a Saturday night was to burn a cross on someone's lawn than the parents that I did have, because they were what I call ambivalent racists, all right? They were good people who kind of felt bad about it, and it was sort of subconscious, but then even the conscious part they kind of thought was justified, but then they felt bad. And if they'd been blatant about it, I think when I was 19 years old and went off to college, I would say, that's stupid, and they're wrong, and get on with it. But instead it was subtle. And the particular subtlety I experienced, I'm thinking of my mother, was that We lived in a neighborhood that was primarily Anglo-Saxon. We had a few minorities. And every time a minority would move into the neighborhood, she made such a big deal out of it. And she would say, oh, let's go say hello, let's bring them food, let's welcome them over. It was this big self-conscious thing. Whereas when a person that looked more like us moved in, it was like, oh, hi, I'll write them a note. And that kind of got inside me. Why is this such a big deal? Ooh, these people must be different somehow. And she was trying to be nice. I'm not putting her down for it, but a subtle message. Media. Over and over and over again, Tufts University has studied the impact of images on each of us. And what they discovered is that when viewers see black people treated badly in an image, our conscious attitude toward that group does not change, but our subconscious attitude, measured by tests similar to the implicit association test, falls apart just from seeing that image immediately. That's creepy. And when we see as many images as we do, it's amazing. So be aware of that. Be aware how unreliable those are. Experience. You know, just because you have one bad experience or 10 bad experiences with a particular group does not prove a darn thing. It doesn't. Sure, biases came from somewhere. Stereotypes came from somewhere. There are a few Southern Californians that are flaky. There are some Asians that are good at math. There are some New Yorkers who are loud. Come on, let's get real. But it isn't everybody. And that's where experience messes us up, and particularly negative experiences, because they stay with us longer than positive ones do. And that really leads me to want to say, when these things happen in the media, when there's a bombing or a slaughter or some awful thing happens, debrief it with your colleagues in the workplace. You know, after 9/11, the companies that did the best were the ones that sat down and talked about it and vented it and got it out and made it clear who really did it, who did not do it, who doesn't believe in it. You know, it's important. Otherwise, those experiences get inside us really, really quickly. So, first question, was my source reliable for the bias? Second question, how many people do you actually know who conform to this bias? When I say actually know, I do not mean seen across the parking lot, heard a rumor about, saw on TV. And it's so odd how we feel we know a lot, but when we analyze it, we go, now wait a minute. Like, for example, when I was writing the book, I was interviewing a bunch of people. And I was speaking to this woman on the phone, and she said that we're talking about workplaces and stuff. And she said, I've been in the workplace for 25 years, and I've had 3 male bosses, and all 3 of them were sexist. So that's how I know all men are sexist. Okay. So let's give it to her for the moment. Let's say that these men really were sexist. There wasn't just that she misread it or that the first 2 were horrible, but the third one was fine, but she couldn't see it because of her past experience. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Let's give it to her. So I got off the phone and I thought, well, let me see if I can figure out roughly how many men might have been her boss during her 25 years, and she worked in the U.S., so in the United States. And I don't know how I came up with some figure of 120 million. Okay. So then I emailed my accountant, and I said, what percentage is 3 out of 120 million? And he came back, and when I'm speaking, I can never do this because now I can see it in front of me. It's let me count the zeros, 0.000003%, which is 3/millionth of 1%. I'm not good at math, so whatever that means. So this woman was basing her inflexible belief on 3 men out of 120 million. Now, of course, there's more men than that are sexist. I'm not saying there's not, but that shows how quickly we do it because that negative experience stayed with her. So our first strategy for reducing our biases to work within ourselves and with our teams, really analyze it. You're smart people. We're smart people. Look at it really hard. Where the heck did I learn it? Was it reliable? Do I really know a bunch of folks to prove the thing? Or is this something that is just, based on a tiny little bit or based on a rumor? So Our second strategy for reducing bias, and my favorite, is to identify common ground through what I call shared kinship groups. Now this is going to get a little complicated, so hang here with me. A kinship group is any population that shares a self or externally ascribed characteristic that sets it apart from others, any characteristic. For example, in this image, let's say these are the people on the stairs are volunteers. They're a group. They're a kinship group, right? The family is a kinship group, and people who have families are a kinship group. The image in the middle, people who have faith or are concerned with spirituality, people who love nature, people who love children, people who have children, people who are children. And by the way, while we're at it, those are my grandchildren. Aren't they cute? Okay, I shall hear you symbolically going, yeah, they're very cool. Okay, so each and every one of us is a member of dozens of these kinship groups. Golfers, Muslims, Democrats, Republicans, gardeners, people that like to sit on the aisle seat on airplanes, people that sit in the window seats on airplanes. I think people that sit in the middle are weird, so we won't go there. But people who watch TV or don't, and like that, anything at all. So hang with that idea just for a moment. That's what a kinship group is. Now, identifying common ground through shared kinship groups helps defeat bias because the process transforms a them into an us. Now, this is where it gets tricky. I am not saying that we become alike at all. We value diversity. We honor diversity. We promote diversity. We want to have all that variety, right? We want to respect people for who they are as individuals. But in some ways, we can still be an us. In some ways, we can be alike. So, identifying common ground through shared kinship groups helps defeat bias because the process transforms a them into an us. Here is a very vacuous, superficial example, but it does say it. If I were in the room, I'd ask you where the dog lovers were, the cat lovers, right? Those are kinship groups, right? Dog lovers, that's a younger picture of the puppy, by the way. Okay, I don't know who the cat is. Probably wandered through the backyard. Okay, dog lovers, cat lovers. Two separate kinship groups. To each of them, the cats are a them, the dog lovers are an us. To the cat lover, they're an us, the dog lovers are a them. All right, what happens if we were to identify a third kinship group? That's what happens. Suddenly, we're no longer them and an us. We're animal lovers. I don't care what this has to do with what the specifics of this are. So now we're still cat lovers, we're still dog lovers, we're still racially different, we're still culturally different, but we're common in some way, right? It's in that commonality that we can start to begin to beat this kind of things. Now, let me give an example. There was a woman, I heard about her in the media. She was a manager of a nursing home, and she had an awful problem because she had two residents of her home that were deeply depressed and would not come out of their rooms. And she didn't know what to do. So she was looking at their files, she was interviewing their family, trying to find something that was going to spark them. And she had an extra problem, too. It wasn't just that they were depressed. One of them was black, one of them was white, and each of them was deeply racist against the other person's group. So that was a problem. So getting them to hang together wasn't necessarily going to do the job. But then she started to find out a couple of things. Well, one, she already knew that they both had strokes, so they had that in common. And she also learned they had something else in common, that they had both been professional pianists before they retired. And then she noticed something. One of them had had a stroke on her right side. The other one had had a stroke on her left side. And you know where I'm going here. She managed to cajole them, I don't mean it was instantaneous, out of their rooms, sit them down at the piano, and get them to play together, right side and left side. and they were able to fulfill that dream again. And darn, if that new kinship group of being able to play the piano together didn't begin to soften them and make them friends. Were they each still going to be kind of racist, fundamentally? Yeah, maybe. But they were getting along, and they formed that group, and it reduced the bias between them. This is powerful stuff. Why does this work? The reason that this works, several reasons. Part of it is physiological. When we are spending a lot of time with someone and we're familiar with them, our brain actually puts more neurons to the task of seeing them as an individual human being, not just as a member of a group, okay? So that they will, the more time we spend, the more we see them as an us, the more we see them as an individual. Then there's another factor. By definition, remember, we're now an us. We are animal lovers. We are piano players, okay? The rubric, the language, the hook that we hang the difference on, i.e. the bias, we don't need it anymore, because that person next to us at the piano is Rachel, the person playing the piano. She's no longer black woman or white woman who has this particular characteristic that I can hang on her. See what I'm getting at? So the more, but she's still black, you're still white, we still respect that. That's not going away. It's just added to it. So I know it's a little hard to grasp in this short time, but I want you to really think about this and maybe talk about it. Now, how do we do this, right? Let's start with a very simple strategy, and that is keep what we share top of mind. We notice what we decide is most important. Have any of you recently decided to buy a new car? Okay, I did. A couple of years ago it was. And do you notice something kind of weird that starts to happen when you decide what model of car you want and what color? Suddenly you notice them everywhere, right? I mean, I bought this car. I thought it was unusual. Once I decided, I saw there was one around the corner. I was so disappointed. I mean, they were everywhere. And I thought it was different. Why? It's a concept called saliency determination, the fact that we notice what we care about. In our workplaces, I think that we should start to continue to value diversity, but start to just kind of notice what we have in common. Find ways to notice. Call attention to it, rather than acting like there's something sort of wrong in doing that. Because, looking at what we share and how we're different, to me, are just two sides of the inclusion coin. One does not negate the other. And we can do them both at the same time. There's no doubt about it. Now, there's another step we can take. Create opportunities for contact. Employee resource groups, clubs, interactive events, volunteer efforts, social outings. We historically have, and I'm sure many of you do, employee resource groups that are founded around ethnic lines, sexual orientation, gender, race, and categories of that nature. They started, as most of you know, back in the mid-'70s at Pepsi, and they're great, fantastic. They're really important. But something's being added to those these days. Many organizations are starting to form employee resource groups about common interests and common concerns, common challenges. So what starts to happen is, in those employee resource groups, we are mixing together races, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, all the ways persons with disabilities, persons that are fully abled, mixing them together around a common thing. In other words, we are forming common kinship groups. That's what's happening. So just a couple of examples. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone before in the call, but you've got parenting groups. You've got an interfaith group, which is kind of cool, because what they've done is brought together, last count, I think, 8 religions under this interfaith group. And as I understand it, it's helped relieve tension between those religions, but also form this kinship group of people who care about faith, about values, about hard work, and those kinds of things. Abbott Labs has a part-time workers group, and they've got a veterans group. I think many organizations have that. Kimberly Clark has a parents interactive network, they call it, and a family caregivers network. And that's a big one. Many of your employees have elder care responsibilities, and you can bring people together around the challenge of that. How can we help each other? What strategies have you used? And again, of course, they serve as resources for the organization as well. There's disability groups. There's adoption groups, people that have adopted children. It goes on and on and on. I mean, it's all limited only by your imagination. But you still have the other groups that are by more obvious categories, more dimensions of diversity, but also groups that bring people together. Clearly the same thing can happen with clubs and interactive events. Volunteer efforts can be extremely powerful at bringing people together, and social outings, all those kinds of things. Now, however, this contact isn't just any kind of contact. For years this has been kicking around, what kind of contact is most effective at reducing biases, and I've seen it kind of torque through the years, and this is roughly where we stand now. Keep this in mind. The contact needs to be sort of unhurried. You can hang together, appropriately intimate, change it up. Goal-oriented is huge, extremely important. For some reason, authority-sanctioned gatherings or groups has more power to reduce the biases, and I wish I had an explanation to that. I don't know. And also among relative equals in status and resources. I think that probably has to do with comfort level between people, being able to come together comfortably. And a final one, and I think this is important to reiterate, is the notion of shared goals. The emphasis within your department on what you're trying to accomplish, the emphasis within your association, if there's any nonprofits here, of what your goals are. Ultimately, isn't that the ultimate shared responsibility? So, what we've done is we've looked first at what a bias is, those inflexible positive or negative conscious or unconscious beliefs about a particular category of people. And the problem with them ultimately is that they keep us from seeing human beings as individual people, for what they have to bring to your organization, for what they need, for how you could be respectful toward them, and for what they need in order to live whole and complete lives and bring their whole selves to your workplace. We know we've got a couple of ways to look at our unconscious biases, and one is that implicit association test. And we do have a minute here, so I'm going to tell you my secret. Okay, it's not a secret really. What they discovered is that if you go in to take that test, and while you take it, you hold in your mind an image of a member of the group visually being in a position that would be considered a non-biased attitude toward them. For example, picture that woman as a CEO behind a podium or at a big desk or something like that. You picture that, your biases will tend to go underground for a little while. And you have that image in your head, and your reactions are going to the test, the speed with which you link those characteristics are going to be faster because that image is there. That effect does not last forever. It only lasts for a little while, and then it starts to fade. But I think what's interesting about that is the importance of what we're thinking, and the importance of what we're looking at, and the importance of the conversations that we're having, and that they get inside us and they influence us. And it is kind of creepy. But there also, as we've seen, is an awful lot that we can do about them. So does anyone have any questions? I know I've tossed a lot of information at you rather quickly, but I'd be glad to take any questions from anyone because we've got a few minutes, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, we've got a couple really good questions here. A couple people have asked about how do you differentiate between a bias and a stereotype? Oh,
excellent. Thanks for asking. Oh, love these good questions. It's fantastic. Fundamentally, they're the same thing. Fundamentally, it is the inflexibility that makes it a bias. So I would say they're the same. When I wrote the book, I spent many hours trying to figure out what the best term to use was. Because when you plow the internet, there's all these different definitions. And I went back and forth between stereotype and bias because they are the same. But I didn't want to go to prejudice, and I didn't want to go to some of the other ones because they seem to have a little more of a narrow function. This bias seemed to encompass it all. So good question. I do not make a distinction between them.
Excellent. Another question is, how should implicit bias awareness impact the way we think about culture fit in the workplace?
About what? About culture fit? What'd you say?
Yeah, culture fit.
Culture fit. I'm not quite sure what context that comes from or what's meant by that, but I'm thinking that probably that means how are we in danger of our implicit biases influencing our judgments of what a person is capable of or what they need in the workplace and what they have to bring to us, if that's what they're getting at. And it is where all this material comes in. When a person is of a particular background, it's all about background here, the person is of a particular background, that there are going to be some general things that would apply to a large number of them, but not all. For example, I am an absolute stereotype of North American Anglo-Saxon culture. I mean, I'm just white. I don't have a white car these days, but I used to say I had a white car, right? I have no rhythm. I am a punctuality freak. You know, I make lists. I'm very linear. You know, all those kind of stereotypes that I'm rather materialistic. All those things when you stereotype a North American, I'm one of them. But not all of us are. And the same thing applies to any culture. And we need to stop and work with the person as an individual. Now get to know them, have conversations, and get our biases consciously, intellectually out of the way. And sometimes we'll find there's characteristics there, as with me, in my case, that are there that you expected to be there. Your bias might be, the content of the bias might be confirmed with one individual. Well, fine, so that's fine. That's where they come from, but easily could not be. So, you know, I think it's tricky, and I hope this was the question, because I used to do cross-cultural training. I still do once in a while, and we had the big debate about, do we teach about cultural differences and cultural characteristics? Or if we teach about them, is that creating stereotypes? And my feeling is that we do teach about them because it's part of who people are. Culture is part of who they are, but we need to teach them in a way that we say, you know, every hour, this is a generality, this is a generality, this is an exception, and do it that way so they do not convert into stereotypes. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thanks. Is there another question? Is there ever a case where there is no common ground? What if someone says we can't find a common ground between us?
Boy, I tell you, not really. I'm not saying a person wouldn't say there's not. Okay, I'm not saying a person wouldn't feel there's not, but in reality, we're all humans. We're all in some ways afraid. We're all in some ways satisfied. Most of us have families. Most of us like recreation. Most of us have concerns about our future. And this is on the cuff, and how many commonalities have I just come up with? You know, most of us are, not most of us, but, you know, basically like our jobs. A few of us don't. All of those are things that can be commonalities. And even if there's a disagreement, it goes us back to the old agree to disagree thing. There's the fact we don't agree. That's a commonality. I mean, think about those women at that piano. I mean, that was a tough one. And she cracked it, and it's not unusual. And so I think someone's not digging deep enough to find that commonality. I think it's there, but someone might refuse to try, and that's a whole other story.
Right. Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by authority sanctioned? Just tell us a little bit more about that.
It's a little bit of a mystery to me, and I have maybe if anybody has any literature on it, because I dug to try to find literature on just why that's the case, because I like understanding whys for things. But what it means is that if the head of your department said, you know what, I think this would be cool, let's all get together and have a Saturday cleanup of a local community, and we'll all go out and volunteer together to clean it up. If that, sorry, I apologize, that's my cell phone, it was on for safety. If let's all go out and clean the community together, the fact that that authority figure said it, and it was her idea, causes the people to feel a little more like it's a shared goal, and that a little more like they ought to try harder within that activity to see each other. They're not aware of this, by the way. I don't mean that they're aware of it, but really try harder to be there in that moment, in that activity, and see what happens. That's what I'm talking about. And it might be a CEO saying, or the head of the diversity inclusion department, or HR, or somebody saying, let's start an ERG around some sort of a particular category. It has a little more power. I think the other things, though, are more important. This kind of sense of, I think if you could see me physically, I'm kind of acting kind of casual. It's like it's kind of hanging together. Let's be people. Let me give you a quick example of this, spontaneous. Years ago, I was asked to do bias reduction training to the post office here in San Diego, one of their central post office, and they asked me to do the middle of the night shift. I'll never forget it. It was like 11 to 2, and then again from 2:30 to 5:30. I mean, it was like, oh my gosh, it's not my style. And I went in there, and you had people working together. And my memory is there was a young Filipina, there was an Anglo-Saxon male Vietnam vet, a couple of black women, a fellow from Russia, as I recall, and 3 Hispanics, and then 2 people that were older, and then some really young people. Something like that gives you the feeling. It could not have been hardly more diverse. And I got there, and after the first hour and a half, I'm thinking, they need me like a hole in the head. They get along so well. The respect between them was so high. And I even told the client that. I said, these people are doing fine. The client had thought there was a problem just because of their diversity, their external diversity, their visual diversity. And so what was happening was they were working in a rather appropriately intimate setting. They were hanging together throughout the night without a lot of distraction. They had a common goal, which was to get through that night and get the job done. And I've always sort of held that model in my head as something that can be really, really helpful. So that I think gives you a feel for it, for how that getting together, being together can make a difference.
Thank you so much, Sandra. It was a great presentation, and thanks everyone for all your questions. So we here at Workplace Answers, we offer online diversity and inclusion training for enterprise, higher education, and government organizations, covering topics such as leadership, diversity, management techniques, cultural team building, respectful language. And we make our courses highly customizable and available in multiple versions that are designed with the unique needs of your industry or sector in mind. If you're interested in finding out more about Workplace Answers training, including our Uncovering Implicit Bias course, please click the button for Interested, Contact Me. Thank you very much for your attendance today, and we look forward to serving you. Thanks again, Sandra.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your line.